The Deadly Prescription. Welcome back to Mindful Musings, where we invite you to pause, reflect, and lose yourself in tales that stir the soul. I'm your host, William, and today we're venturing into the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where nothing is quite as simple as it seems. Before we begin our journey with the incomparable Miss Marple, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from today. Drop a comment and let me know your corner of the globe. Now, settle in with your favourite beverage and let us begin. Chapter 1. The Pharmacist's Final Dose. The news reached Miss Jane Marple during her morning tea, as most village news did, through the reliable conduit of her maid, Florence. Mr. Edmund Hartley, the village pharmacist, had been found dead in his sitting room above the shop. The initial assumption, Florence reported with appropriate solemnity, was heart failure. The poor man had been complaining of a headache the previous evening. Miss Marple set down her teacup with care. Edmund Hartley had been a fixture of St. Mary Mead for nearly 20 years, a meticulous man who treated his profession with almost religious devotion. She had always found him to be rather fussy, perhaps, but thoroughly reliable. Heart failure seemed an odd end for a man of merely 52 who walked 3 miles daily and never touched spirits. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had gathered her shopping basket and made her way to the high street. The pharmacy remained closed, black crape already hanging on the door. A small knot of villagers stood outside, speaking in hushed tones. Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, was holding forth about the tragedy. Found him in his chair, they say, his evening cocoa still on the table beside him, and the headache powder he'd taken sitting right there. Dr. Layton says it was his heart, just gave out sudden-like. Miss Marple paused to offer her condolences and gather what details she could. It seemed Mr. Hartley had closed the shop at his usual hour of 6 o'clock, gone upstairs to his flat, and prepared himself a light supper. He'd mentioned to his assistant, young Timothy Moss, that he had a beastly headache coming on. Timothy had left him measuring out a powder for himself. Always so particular, was Mr. Hartley, Mrs. Price continued. Wouldn't trust anyone else to fill his own prescriptions. Said he knew exactly what he needed. That afternoon, Miss Marple received a visit from Inspector Slack, who had been called in from the nearby town. The inspector had a peculiar expression on his face, somewhere between irritation and uncertainty. Miss Marple, he began without preamble, Dr. Layton has some concerns about Mr. Hartley's death. The symptoms don't quite align with heart failure. He's requested a post-mortem examination. Miss Marple's blue eyes sharpened with interest. Indeed? How very thorough of Dr. Layton. The thing is, Inspector Slack continued, clearly uncomfortable, there's a prescription bottle by his chair. The label says it's for headache powder, standard ingredients, nothing unusual. But Dr. Layton noticed the powder itself looked odd, different texture than it should have been. Miss Marple considered this information carefully. Edmund Hartley, dead from his own medicine. It seemed almost impossible for a man so careful, so precise in his work, unless, of course, the medicine hadn't been what it claimed to be. I wonder, she said quietly, if I might see this prescription label. Chapter 2. A Broken Letter. Inspector Slack, despite his usual reluctance to involve civilians in police matters, found himself the following morning in Miss Marple's cosy sitting room, laying out a photograph of the prescription label on her tea table. The post-mortem results had come back overnight, confirming Dr. Layton's suspicions. Edmund Hartley had died not of heart failure, but of acute poisoning from an overdose of a powerful barbiturate. Miss Marple examined the photograph through her reading glasses, her knitting needles idle in her lap for once. The label read clearly, "For headache, take 1 powder in water as needed. E. Hartley, pharmacist." The powder was meant to be a simple compound of aspirin and caffeine, Inspector Slack explained. Instead, it contained enough phenobarbital to kill a man twice Mr. Hartley's size. Someone switched the contents. But surely Mr. Hartley would have prepared this himself, Miss Marple asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. That's what makes it so devious. The bottle was in his personal cabinet, where he kept medications for his own use. He'd have had no reason to check the contents. He trusted his own labelling system implicitly. Miss Marple returned her attention to the photograph, tilting it slightly to catch the light. Then she reached for her magnifying glass, a gift from her nephew Raymond, and examined the label more closely. "Inspector," she said after a moment, "would you say this label was recently typed?" The bottle was filled 3 weeks ago, according to his records. "How interesting. You see this letter E here and here and here." She pointed with a thin finger. "It sits slightly higher than the other letters, a very subtle difference, but quite distinctive once you notice it." Inspector Slack leaned in to look. A broken typewriter key? Or a misaligned one? In either case, it creates a rather unique signature. I wonder if we might examine Mr. Hartley's typewriter in the pharmacy. An hour later, they stood in the dim back room of Hartley's pharmacy, where the pharmacist had kept his desk and filing system. The typewriter sat in its usual place, an old but well-maintained machine that Mr. Hartley had used for typing labels and correspondence. Miss Marple typed a quick sentence, then examined the result. Every letter E sat perfectly in line with its fellows. "Not this machine, then," Inspector Slack observed. "No," Miss Marple agreed, "which means someone else typed this label using a different typewriter. Someone who wanted Mr. Hartley to believe he was taking his own harmless headache remedy." But who would have access to his personal medication cabinet, the inspector wondered aloud. Miss Marple glanced around the room, noting the layout. "Anyone who worked here regularly, I should think. The cabinet is visible from the main shop floor. It wouldn't be difficult for someone familiar with the pharmacy to slip in after hours, or during a quiet moment, and make the switch." Inspector Slack pulled out his notebook. Timothy Moss, the assistant, Miss Rosalind Kent, who helps with the bookkeeping 3 days a week, and Mrs. Jeffries, who comes in to clean every evening. "And Mr. Hartley himself, of course," Miss Marple added quietly, though her expression suggested she had already eliminated the deceased from her list of suspects. The shadows were lengthening in the pharmacy's back room as they continued their investigation. Miss Marple noticed something else, a small detail that caught her eye. There was a second typewriter, partially hidden beneath a dust cover on a shelf. Inspector Slack followed her gaze and retrieved it. "I'd forgotten about that one," he said. "Let's see if it matches." The moment Miss Marple struck the keys, she knew every E sat distinctly higher than its neighbours, creating the exact pattern they'd seen on the fatal prescription label. "Well," Inspector Slack said grimly, "now we know which machine was used. The question is, who had access to it?" Chapter 3. The Assistant's Secret. Timothy Moss was a nervous young man of 25, with sandy hair that persisted in falling across his forehead, and a habit of adjusting his spectacles when anxious. Which meant, as Inspector Slack questioned him in the pharmacy's back room the following morning, that he adjusted them approximately every 30 seconds. Miss Marple, present at the inspector's grudging invitation, sat quietly in the corner with her knitting, observing. "I locked up at 6, just as Mr. Hartley instructed," Timothy said for the 3rd time. "He was upstairs already. Said he had a terrible headache and was going to take something for it. I asked if he needed help, but he waved me off. Said he'd been mixing his own remedies for 20 years. "And you heard nothing unusual after you left?" "Nothing at all. I went straight home to my mother's house. We had supper together. Then I spent the evening reading. My mother can confirm it." Inspector Slack made a note. "How long have you worked for Mr. Hartley?" "Nearly 4 years now, since I finished my pharmaceutical training in London." "And your relationship with him was good?" Timothy hesitated, and Miss Marple's needles paused imperceptibly. Mr. Hartley was very exacting. He had high standards, but yes, we got along well enough. "Well enough," the inspector repeated. "That's an interesting phrase. Were there tensions, Mr. Moss?" The young man coloured. "He could be critical. Sometimes I felt he didn't trust me to handle even simple preparations, but that was just his way. He was like that with everyone. "Did you use that second typewriter, the one on the shelf?" Inspector Slack asked suddenly. Timothy looked confused. "Sometimes, yes. When Mr. Hartley's machine was in use, or when I needed to type up inventory lists. Why?" "No particular reason, just gathering facts." After Timothy had been dismissed, Miss Marple spoke quietly. "The young man is hiding something, though I don't believe it's murder." "Oh?" Inspector Slack raised an eyebrow. "He's frightened, certainly, but not of being discovered for killing his employer. He's frightened of something else entirely. Did you notice how his hand trembled when you asked about their relationship?" That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Moss, Timothy's mother, under the guise of ordering a tonic she could easily have purchased at the pharmacy. Mrs. Moss, a thin, worried-looking woman, received her in a small, neat parlour. As they chatted about inconsequential matters, Miss Marple guided the conversation gently toward Timothy's work. "Such a steady position for a young man," she observed, "though I imagine the hours are long." "Too long, if you ask me," Mrs. Moss said with sudden vehemence. "That Mr. Hartley worked my Timothy to the bone, always checking his work, criticising every little thing. Timothy is a qualified pharmacist, Miss Marple, trained in London, but Mr. Hartley treated him like an errand boy." "How very difficult. And yet Timothy stayed." Mrs. Moss's expression shifted to something guarded. "Where else would he go? There's only the one pharmacy in St. Mary Mead, and positions elsewhere are hard to come by. Besides, Timothy felt he owed Mr. Hartley something." "Owed him?" Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Mr. Hartley paid for part of Timothy's training in London, said he was investing in his own succession, but then he never let Timothy forget it. Every mistake was a betrayal of that investment, according to him." Miss Marple filed this away carefully. Financial obligation, coupled with constant criticism, could breed considerable resentment. That evening, she sat in her sitting room, knitting and contemplating the case. Timothy Moss had a motive of sorts, years of resentment toward a critical employer who held his financial debt over his head, but the method spoke of something more calculated than frustrated anger. There was also the matter of the typewriter. If Timothy had regular access to it, he could have typed the label. But would he have been clever enough to recognize the distinctive broken E as a potential clue? And if so, why would he use a machine that could be traced back to the pharmacy? Chapter 4. The Bookkeeper's Bills. Miss Rosalind Kent arrived at the pharmacy every Monday, Wednesday and Friday at precisely 9 o'clock to attend to Mr. Hartley's bookkeeping. She was a woman of 40, unmarried, with a brisk efficiency that made her valuable to several businesses in St. Mary Mead. She kept accounts for the greengrocer, the draper, and the pharmacy, managing their finances with meticulous care. Inspector Slack interviewed her 2 days after Mr. Hartley's death, again with Miss Marple present, observing from her corner with her eternal knitting. "I can't imagine who would want to harm Mr. Hartley," Miss Kent said, her voice crisp and controlled. "He was a thorough businessman, very particular about his records. We worked together without difficulty." "You had access to the back room?" Inspector Slack asked. "Of course. I needed to check inventory against orders, verify receipts, that sort of thing, but I never touched any medications. That wasn't my area." "And the second typewriter, the one on the shelf, did you ever use it?" Miss Kent's eyes narrowed slightly. "Occasionally, yes, when I needed to type correspondence or labels for filing. Mr. Hartley's machine was often in use." "You have a typewriter at home as well?" "Yes, I do my work for my other clients there." "Why these questions about typewriters, Inspector?" "Just being thorough. Would you mind if we examined your home typewriter?" "I most certainly would mind, Inspector, unless you have some specific reason to suspect me of wrongdoing." Inspector Slack backed down, but Miss Marple noted the defensive tone. After Miss Kent had departed, the inspector looked frustrated. "Can't force her to see the typewriter without more evidence, and now she's been warned. She could dispose of it before we get a warrant." Perhaps there's another way, Miss Marple suggested. Miss Kent does bookkeeping for Mr. Graves at the greengrocer, doesn't she? I believe I need to order some vegetables. An hour later, Miss Marple was examining the account books at Graves's greengrocery, ostensibly checking a discrepancy in her last bill. Mr. Graves, always eager to please his customers, had readily agreed. The entries were typed on individual slips that were then pasted into the ledger. Miss Marple studied them carefully through her reading glasses. There, in multiple entries, were letters E sitting just slightly higher than their fellows. The match was unmistakable. "Inspector," she said quietly when they met again that evening, "I believe Miss Kent's typewriter is the one that produced Mr. Hartley's fatal prescription label. Or rather, it shares the same defect as the pharmacy's second typewriter." The next morning, armed with this evidence, Inspector Slack obtained a warrant to examine Miss Kent's typewriter. The machine sat on a desk in her modest sitting room, and when tested, it produced the identical raised E pattern. Faced with the physical evidence, Miss Kent's composure finally cracked. "I didn't kill him," she said, her voice rising with panic. "Yes, I typed labels. I typed many labels, but I never put poison in anything. You have to believe me." "Then why did you type a label for Mr. Hartley's personal medication?" Inspector Slack demanded. Miss Kent sank into a chair, her face pale. "I was replacing medications," she admitted in a whisper. "Expensive ones. I would substitute them with harmless powders and sell the real drugs elsewhere. I needed the money desperately. My mother's in a nursing facility. The costs are ruinous, and I have debts." The full confession spilled out then. For over a year, Miss Kent had been systematically stealing expensive medications from the pharmacy's stock, replacing them with placebos, and selling the genuine articles through a contact in London. She would retype the labels to make everything appear correct. "But the headache powder?" Inspector Slack pressed. "I replaced it with aspirin and sugar. Nothing harmful. If Mr. Hartley died from phenobarbital poisoning, someone else must have switched it after I did. I swear it." Chapter 5. A Question of Motive. Miss Kent sat in the inspector's makeshift office at the village hall, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The confession had drained the colour from her face, leaving her looking older than her 40 years, but her denial of murder remained absolute. "Mr. Hartley found discrepancies in the inventory 3 weeks ago," she continued, her voice steadier now. "He asked me to stay late one Wednesday to go through the books. He was very systematic, checking every entry against physical stock. It took him less than an hour to realize what I'd been doing." "And what did he say?" Inspector Slack asked. "He was horrified. Told me I'd betrayed his trust, endangered his patients, and destroyed his reputation. He said he needed time to think about what to do, whether to report me to the authorities or handle it privately." Miss Kent's voice broke slightly. "He gave me until the end of the month to prepare myself." "That would be this coming Friday," Miss Marple observed quietly from her corner. "Yes, I've been in agony, waiting, but I swear to you I didn't kill him." "Why would I? If anything, his death makes my situation worse. Now there will be a full inventory, investigations. Everything I've done will come to light anyway. If I'd kept quiet and done nothing, I might have found a way to make restitution, convince him to stay silent." Inspector Slack exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. The logic was sound, if one assumed Miss Kent was rational rather than desperate. "The prescription label," the inspector said. "You admit you typed it." "Yes, but weeks ago when I was still substituting medications. That bottle contained nothing but aspirin and sugar. Harmless. If someone poisoned Mr. Hartley, they must have switched the contents after I'd already made my substitution." "That seems rather convenient," Inspector Slack said skeptically. But Miss Marple was frowning thoughtfully. "Miss Kent, you say you replaced expensive medications. Which ones specifically?" "Morphine, primarily. some antibiotics, phenobarbital for patients with severe anxiety and sleep disorders. The phenobarbital was particularly valuable on the black market. And where is that stock now? Miss Kent looked away. I sold it, all of it, to a man in London who asked no questions. When did you make this particular sale? The last batch went 2 weeks ago, about 40 bottles worth. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked rhythmically. So, if Mr. Hartley checked his phenobarbital stock in the past 2 weeks, he would have found it significantly depleted. Yes, that's what started his investigation. He noticed the phenobarbital was nearly gone, but the records showed we should have had months of supply remaining. After Miss Kent was taken to a cell to await formal charges for theft, Inspector Slack turned to Miss Marple with evident frustration. "What are you thinking? Do you believe her story about not committing murder?" "I'm thinking," Miss Marple said slowly, "that Miss Kent may be telling the truth about not intending murder, but if she replaced the phenobarbital with harmless powder and someone else replaced her harmless powder with actual phenobarbital, where did they obtain it? From the stock she sold in London? Possibly, or from somewhere else in the pharmacy. Mr. Hartley was a cautious man, Inspector. I suspect he kept emergency reserves of controlled substances separate from his main inventory." They returned to the pharmacy, now closed and sealed. In a locked cabinet in the dispensary's far corner, behind several boxes of gauze and bandages, they found exactly what Miss Marple expected. A backup stock of controlled substances, including 6 bottles of phenobarbital, kept separate from the main inventory for emergencies. "Someone with knowledge of pharmacy operations would know about this," Miss Marple observed. "Someone who understood that pharmacists often maintain such supplies, and someone who had access to this locked cabinet." Inspector Slack checked the cabinet lock. No signs of forced entry. Whoever opened this had a key. "Or knew where Mr. Hartley kept his keys," Miss Marple added thoughtfully. Chapter 6. The Cleaner's Observations. Mrs. Jeffries was a stout woman in her 60s who had cleaned Hartley's pharmacy every evening for the past decade. She arrived at precisely 6:30 each day after the shop closed and worked for exactly 90 minutes. She was, as Inspector Slack discovered when he interviewed her, a woman who noticed everything and forgot nothing. "I always knew when something was amiss," she said, settling her considerable bulk into a chair in her tidy kitchen. Miss Marple and Inspector Slack sat opposite her, teacups balanced on their laps. Mr. Hartley was a creature of habit. Every evening, the same routine. Close the shop, count the till, lock the cabinets, go upstairs. Like clockwork, he was. "And on the evening he died," the inspector prompted. "That evening was different. I arrived at 6:30 as usual, and the shop was already locked up tight. But when I let myself in with my key, I could hear voices upstairs. Mr. Hartley and someone else, having quite the discussion. Miss Marple, who had been studying the doily on the arm of her chair, looked up with sudden interest. Could you make out what they were saying?" "Not the words exactly, but the tone was clear enough. They were arguing, or rather Mr. Hartley was upset about something, and the other person was trying to calm him down. I heard Mr. Hartley say something about betrayal and professional standards. That much came through clear." "Could you identify the other voice?" Mrs. Jeffries hesitated, her brow furrowing with concentration. "It was muffled, you understand. Could have been a man or a woman, but whoever it was, they were there for a good 20 minutes before leaving by the side door." "The side door," Inspector Slack made a note, "leads to the alley behind the shops. I heard it close while I was cleaning the dispensary. Then everything went quiet upstairs. I finished my work and left at 8 o'clock as always. Mr. Hartley didn't come down, but that wasn't unusual if he wasn't feeling well." "Did you notice anything else unusual that evening?" Miss Marple asked. "Anything out of place in the shop itself?" Mrs. Jeffries considered this. "Now that you mention it, yes. The back room was tidier than usual. Papers all stacked neat, The second typewriter had been moved from the shelf to the desk, and there was a smell, faint like of carbolic soap, not the usual scent of the pharmacy. Carbolic soap, Miss Marple repeated. How interesting. After they left Mrs. Jeffreys, Miss Marple was thoughtful. Inspector, we need to determine who had keys to that side door. Mr. Hartley himself, obviously, Timothy Moss as his assistant, Miss Kent for her bookkeeping work, and Mrs. Jeffreys for cleaning. And no one else? Not according to the records we've found, though I suppose someone could have borrowed a key and had a copy made. Miss Marple considered this. 4 people with access. 4 people who might have entered that evening. Yet Mrs. Jeffreys heard someone leave by that door, which suggests they had a key to lock it behind them. And there's the matter of the carbolic soap. Who among our suspects would smell of carbolic? A cleaner might, Inspector Slack suggested. But Mrs. Jeffreys was already there, and she wouldn't have remarked on a smell she herself had brought in. No, I think this suggests someone else, someone concerned with cleanliness and hygiene. That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Timothy Moss stood on her doorstep, looking even more nervous than usual, his spectacles slightly askew. Miss Marple, might I speak with you privately? It's about Mr. Hartley, and I can't bring myself to tell Inspector Slack. He'll think I'm guilty. She invited him into her sitting room and waited patiently while he gathered his courage. The young man paced before the fireplace, his hands clenching and unclenching. I wasn't entirely truthful with Inspector Slack, he finally said, about my relationship with Mr. Hartley. We did have tensions, but not just because he was critical of my work. There was something else, something I discovered by accident about 3 months ago. Go on, Miss Marple encouraged gently. Timothy took a deep breath. I found a ledger, a second set of books that Mr. Hartley kept hidden in his desk. It showed sales of medications that weren't recorded in the official pharmacy records. Expensive drugs, controlled substances being sold without proper prescriptions. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. Mr. Hartley was dealing in illegal drug sales? I think so. The amounts were substantial, thousands of pounds over the past few years. I didn't know what to do. If I reported him, I'd lose my position and he'd paid for my training. But if I stayed silent, I was complicit in something illegal. Did you confront him? Timothy nodded miserably. 2 weeks ago. He denied it at first, then admitted it, but said I had no proof, that he could easily claim the ledger was fake, planted by me. He said if I told anyone, he'd ruin my reputation, claim I was the one stealing drugs. Who would believe a young assistant over an established pharmacist? So you said nothing? I said nothing. But then he died, and now everyone thinks someone murdered him, and I keep wondering if it's connected to his illegal activities. What if someone from London, someone he was selling to, decided to silence him? Miss Marple regarded the young man with sympathy. Mr. Moss, you must tell Inspector Slack all of this. Yes, it will be difficult, but withholding information in a murder investigation is far more serious than anything else you've done. After Timothy left, promising reluctantly to speak with the inspector in the morning, Miss Marple sat alone with her thoughts. The case was becoming more complex. Miss Kent had been replacing medications with placebos and selling them, but it appeared Mr. Hartley had been engaged in similar activities himself. 2 separate schemes running parallel, each unaware of the other until Mr. Hartley's inventory check revealed the discrepancies. But which scheme had led to murder? Or had the murder been motivated by something else entirely? Chapter 7. The London Connection. The following morning brought Inspector Slack to Miss Marple's cottage before she'd finished her breakfast. He looked as though he hadn't slept, his collar askew and his normally neat hair ruffled. Timothy Moss came to see me first thing, he said without preamble. Told me about Hartley's illegal drug sales. I'd been through those hidden ledgers he mentioned. Miss Marple, this case has become considerably more complicated. Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea. I suspected as much. Mr. Hartley was not quite the... upstanding citizen he appeared to be. According to these records, he's been selling controlled substances without proper prescriptions for at least 3 years. Morphine, cocaine, phenobarbital, all going to contacts in London. The profits are substantial, nearly £5,000. And Miss Kent was conducting her own similar scheme, entirely unaware that her employer was doing the same thing. Inspector Slack nodded grimly. When Hartley did his inventory check, he would have discovered that someone else was stealing from him. Someone was cutting into his illegal profits. A falling out among thieves, as it were, Miss Marple murmured. But, Inspector, this raises an important question. If Mr. Hartley was already engaged in illegal activities, might he have had enemies in London, people who would have a reason to want him silenced? That's exactly what I'm concerned about. I've wired the Metropolitan Police asking them to investigate Hartley's contacts there, but it will take time. Time we may not have, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. You see, Inspector, I don't believe this murder was committed by someone from London. Inspector Slack looked surprised. Why not? Because of the method. This was an intimate crime, carefully planned by someone with detailed knowledge of the pharmacy, Mr. Hartley's habits, and access to his personal medications. A criminal from London would have used more direct methods, a knife, a gun. This poisoning required someone who understood pharmaceuticals and could move about the pharmacy without arousing suspicion. So we're back to our original suspects, Timothy Moss, Rosalind Kent, and Mrs. Jeffries. Perhaps, though there may be others we haven't considered. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythmic clicking. Tell me, Inspector, have you investigated Mr. Hartley's personal life, his relationships outside of business? He was a solitary man, never married, no close family. His life seemed to revolve entirely around the pharmacy. How sad, Miss Marple said softly. And yet, someone felt strongly enough about him to commit murder. That suggests a personal connection, not merely a business one. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the village doctor, Dr. Layton, under the pretext of discussing her rheumatism. The doctor, a kindly man in his 60s, welcomed her into his consulting room. After the obligatory examination and prescription, Miss Marple turned the conversation to Edmund Hartley. Such a terrible business, she said. Had you known Mr. Hartley long, Doctor? Nearly 20 years. We arrived in St. Mary Mead around the same time. We weren't close friends, but we had a professional relationship. I wrote prescriptions, he filled them. And you never noticed anything unusual about his practice? Dr. Layton hesitated. I did wonder occasionally about some of the quantities of controlled substances he ordered. They seemed high for a village pharmacy, but I assumed he was supplying other practices in the area. Did you ever discuss this with him? Once, about 6 months ago. He became quite defensive, said I was questioning his professional judgment. We had words. I dropped the matter. Miss Marple filed this away. And on the evening he died, did you see him at all? No, my evening surgery ended at 6, and I went straight home. As Miss Marple left the doctor's office, she nearly collided with a young woman she didn't recognize. The woman apologized profusely, but Miss Marple noticed she'd been standing near the doctor's door, possibly listening. Quite all right, my dear, Miss Marple said pleasantly. I don't believe we've met. Are you new to St. Mary Mead? The woman, perhaps 30, with dark hair and an anxious expression, hesitated. I'm just visiting, passing through. But something in her manner made Miss Marple doubt this. After the woman hurried away, Miss Marple mentioned the encounter to Inspector Slack when they met that evening. A young woman, anxious, clearly not local, possibly eavesdropping on my conversation with Dr. Layton. I thought it worth mentioning. Inspector Slack frowned. I'll make inquiries at the local inn, see if any strangers have taken rooms there recently. The inspector's inquiries bore fruit the next morning. A young woman named Sarah Hartley had checked into the Blue Boar Inn 3 days before Edmund Hartley's death. She'd given her address as London and said she was in St. Mary Mead on family business. Hartley, Inspector Slack said significantly, could be a relation. I think we should speak with her as soon as possible, Miss Marple said. Chapter 8. Family Secrets Revealed. Sarah Hartley received them in the small sitting room of the Blue Boar Inn with evident reluctance. She was, as Miss Marple had observed, a woman of about 30, with dark, intelligent eyes that held a mixture of grief and anger. Yes, Edmund Hartley was my uncle, she said once they were seated. My father's brother, though we hadn't spoken in nearly 10 years. Why is that, Miss Hartley? Inspector Slack asked gently. Sarah's hands twisted in her lap. My father died 10 years ago of a morphine overdose. The official verdict was accidental death. He'd been prescribed morphine for chronic pain, but the dose that killed him was far higher than anything his doctor had authorized. I'm very sorry, Miss Marple said quietly. The morphine came from my uncle's pharmacy. My father had been going there for years for his medications. After he died, I found receipts showing he'd been buying increasingly large quantities, far more than he should have needed. I confronted Uncle Edmund, accused him of supplying my father with excessive amounts, essentially feeding his addiction. What did he say? He denied everything, said my father must have obtained morphine from other sources, but I knew that wasn't true. My father barely left the house those last few years. Uncle. Edmund was his only supplier. Sarah's voice hardened. I told him I'd report him to the authorities. He laughed, said I had no proof, that it would be my word against his reputation. Inspector Slack leaned forward. And did you report him? I tried, but he was right. I had no proof beyond my suspicions. The pharmacy board investigated and found nothing irregular in his records. Of course they didn't. He was careful to keep his illegal sales off the official books. Why did you come to St. Mary Mead now, after all these years? Miss Marple asked. Sarah's expression shifted to something more complex. I received a letter 2 weeks ago, anonymous. It said that if I wanted justice for my father, I should come to St. Mary Mead, that Edmund Hartley's crimes were about to be exposed. Do you still have this letter? Sarah retrieved it from her handbag. The letter was brief, typed on plain paper. Your uncle's illegal activities are coming to light. If you want justice for your father, come to St. Mary Mead before month's end. The truth will finally be revealed. Miss Marple examined the letter carefully, then looked up with sharp interest. Inspector, might I see that magnifying glass? She studied the typed letters intently. There, consistent throughout, were the slightly raised E letters that had become so significant in this case. This letter was typed on the same machine that produced Mr. Hartley's prescription label, she announced, the second typewriter in the pharmacy. Sarah looked shocked. What does that mean? It means, Inspector Slack said slowly, that someone wanted you here in St. Mary Mead at the time of your uncle's death. Someone who knew about your history with him. But who and why? Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her fingers absently working her knitting needles. Miss Hartley, where were you on the evening your uncle died? Here, in my room. I'd only arrived that afternoon and was trying to decide whether to confront him or wait to see what this anonymous letter writer had meant about the truth being revealed. In the end, I did nothing, and the next morning I heard he was dead. Did you go to the pharmacy at all during your visit? No, I couldn't bring myself to face him yet. After Sarah Hartley left, Inspector Slack turned to Miss Marple with frustration evident on his face. Every answer leads to more questions. Who sent that letter? And more importantly, who typed it on the pharmacy's typewriter? Someone with access to the pharmacy, Miss Marple said. Someone who knew about Sarah Hartley's existence and her grievance against her uncle. Someone who wanted her here as a witness or perhaps as a suspect. Timothy Moss or Rosalind Kent could have typed it. Both had access to that typewriter. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. But there's something else to consider. The timing of the letter. It was sent 2 weeks ago, which coincides with when Mr. Hartley discovered the inventory. Discrepancies and confronted Miss Kent. It also coincides with when Timothy Moss claims he confronted Mr. Hartley about the hidden ledgers. Inspector Slack's eyes narrowed. You think one of them sent the letter to create additional confusion, to provide other suspects? Possibly, or perhaps someone wanted Sarah Hartley here for another reason entirely. Miss Marple paused, studying the letter again. Inspector, I think it's time we gathered everyone together. There are still pieces missing from this puzzle, but I believe I'm beginning to see the pattern. Chapter 9. The pattern emerges. 2 days later, Inspector Slack assembled all the principals in the case in Miss Marple's sitting room. It was an unusual venue for such a gathering, but the inspector had learned to trust Miss Marple's instincts, even when they led to unconventional methods. Timothy Moss sat rigidly in a straight-backed chair, his spectacles reflecting the afternoon light. Rosalind Kent occupied the sofa, her posture defensive despite her surface calm. Mrs. Jeffries, the cleaner, perched on a footstool near the door, looking bewildered at being included. Dr. Layton had been invited as well, along with Sarah Hartley, who sat slightly apart from the others, watching everyone with wary eyes. Miss Marple took her customary seat by the window, her knitting in her lap. Inspector Slack stood near the fireplace, his notebook at the ready. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began in her gentle voice. "I know this has been a difficult time for everyone. The death of Edmund Hartley has shocked our village and revealed aspects of his life that many of us found surprising and disturbing." "I don't see why we need to rehash all this," Rosalind Kent said sharply. "I've already confessed to my crimes. What more do you want?" "Patience, Miss Kent," Inspector Slack said. "Miss Marple has some observations that may shed light on exactly what happened the night Mr. Hartley died." Miss Marple's needles began their rhythmic clicking. The key to this case has always been the prescription label, that distinctive typewriter with the raised E letters. We know that label was typed on the second typewriter in the pharmacy, the one kept on the shelf in the back room. She paused, looking at each person in turn. We also know that both Miss Kent and Mr. Moss had access to this typewriter. Miss Kent used it to create false labels for the medications she was substituting. Mr. Moss used it occasionally for inventory lists and correspondence. Timothy shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "But there's something interesting about that typewriter," Miss Marple continued. "Mrs. Jeffries, you mentioned that on the evening of Mr. Hartley's death, you noticed the typewriter had been moved from its usual place on the shelf to the desk. Do you remember?" Mrs. Jeffries nodded. "Yes, miss. Struck me as odd, that did." "Indeed. And you also mentioned a smell of carbolic soap, which was unusual for the pharmacy." Miss Marple turned to Dr. Layton. "Doctor, you routinely use carbolic soap in your practice, don't you?" Dr. Layton looked startled. "Well, yes. All medical professionals do. It's standard for hygiene." "Quite so. But Mr. Hartley used a different type of soap in his pharmacy, a lavender-scented one. I noticed it when I visited the shop some weeks ago. So the presence of carbolic soap that evening is significant." Inspector Slack was watching Miss Marple intently. "Are you suggesting Dr. Layton was at the pharmacy that evening?" "I'm suggesting we consider all possibilities," Miss Marple said calmly. "Dr. Layton, you mentioned that you and Mr. Hartley had words about 6 months ago regarding the quantities of controlled substances he was ordering." "That's correct, but I don't see what that has to do with anything." "Bear with me, Doctor. After that conversation, did you continue to monitor Mr. Hartley's activities?" Dr. Layton hesitated. "I kept my eyes open, yes. As a medical professional, I have a responsibility to report suspicious activity. Over the following months, I became increasingly convinced that Edmund was running some sort of illegal operation." "And did you confront him again?" "Not until recently. About 3 weeks ago, I went to him with evidence I'd compiled. Patients who had been prescribed certain medications were not showing the expected improvements. When I questioned them, some admitted their medications seemed ineffective. Others had deteriorated despite supposedly taking their prescribed drugs." Miss Marple nodded. "You suspected he was substituting fake medications?" "Yes. I told Edmund I was going to report him to the authorities, unless he stopped immediately and made restitution to the patients he'd harmed. And what did he say? Dr. Layton's face darkened. He laughed at me, said I had no proof that would stand up in court, that it would be his word against mine, and who would believe a country doctor over an established pharmacist? He said if I tried to expose him, he'd claim I was the one writing fraudulent prescriptions to cover my own mistakes. Sarah Hartley gasped softly. That's exactly what he said to me 10 years ago. The same tactics. Indeed, Miss Marple said. Mr. Hartley was quite skilled at protecting himself. But, Dr. Layton, you didn't give up, did you? The doctor's jaw tightened. No. I began my own investigation. I discovered that Edmund wasn't just substituting medications. He was selling the real drugs illegally in London. I also found evidence of his role in other deaths besides Sarah's father. At least 3 patients in the past 5 years who died from what appeared to be overdoses or adverse drug reactions. My God, Timothy Moss whispered. So, you decided to take matters into your own hands, Miss Marple said quietly. Dr. Layton stood abruptly. Are you accusing me of murder, Miss Marple? I'm suggesting you had ample motive, Doctor, and opportunity. You would have known about the phenobarbital, how to obtain a lethal dose, and how to disguise it as a simple headache powder. You could have visited the pharmacy that evening, as Mrs. Jeffreys heard voices upstairs. Mr. Hartley might have admitted you without suspicion, a fellow professional coming to discuss matters. This is preposterous, Dr. Layton said, but his voice lacked conviction. Inspector Slack moved closer to the doctor. Dr. Layton, I must ask you directly. Were you at Hartley's pharmacy on the evening of his death? A long silence stretched through the room. Finally, Dr. Layton sank back into his chair, looking suddenly older. Yes, he said quietly. I was there, but I didn't kill him. Chapter 10. The Final Stitch. Dr. Layton's admission sent a shock through the assembled group. Sarah Hartley leaned forward, her face intense with emotion. Timothy Moss removed his spectacles and wiped them with shaking hands. Even Rosalind Kent's composed facade cracked slightly. I think you'd better explain, Doctor, Inspector Slack said, his hand moving instinctively toward his pocket where he kept his handcuffs. Dr. Layton took a deep breath. I went to see Edmund that evening because I discovered something new, something that changed everything. I'd been going through old patient records and I found evidence that Edmund had been systematically stealing and selling medications for over a decade. But I also found something else. He paused, looking directly at Rosalind Kent. I found that someone else had been doing the same thing for the past year. The handwriting on certain inventory adjustments didn't match Edmund's. I suspected Miss Kent, but I needed proof before I could act. Rosalind Kent's face paled. I confronted Edmund with all of it, Dr. Layton continued, not just his crimes, but the fact that someone else was stealing from him. I told him that I had compiled enough evidence to destroy both of them, and that I intended to go to the authorities the following day. What was his reaction? Miss Marple asked gently. He was furious, more furious than I'd ever seen him, but not at me. He was angry at whoever had been stealing from him. He said they'd betrayed him, that they were cutting into his profits. He actually seemed more upset about that than about the prospect of being exposed for his own crimes. Did he know it was Miss Kent? He suspected her. He said he'd already confronted her and given her until the end of the month to confess or face exposure. He seemed to think he could use that as leverage somehow, threaten to expose her if she testified against him. Inspector Slack frowned. So, what happened next? We argued. I told him his tactics wouldn't work anymore, that I had enough evidence to bring down both of them. He became defensive, then calculating. He offered me money to stay quiet. A substantial sum. When I refused, he threatened to claim I was involved in his operation, that I'd been writing the false prescriptions. The same threat he made to Timothy Moss and to Sarah Hartley, Miss Marple observed. Yes, it was his pattern. But I wasn't intimidated. I told him I'd see him in court and left by the side door. That was around 7 o'clock. When I left, he was alive, angry, but very much alive. I went home and spent the evening preparing my evidence to present to the authorities. "Can anyone verify this?" Inspector Slack asked. "My housekeeper can confirm when I arrived home. I was there by 7:15. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm. "So, if you left Mr. Hartley alive at 7 and Mrs. Jeffries left at 8, that means someone else must have visited between those times. Someone who had access to the pharmacy and knew where Mr. Hartley kept his medications." She turned to Timothy Moss. "Mr. Moss, I think it's time you told us the complete truth about that evening." Timothy's face went white. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. You see, I've been thinking about the typewriter and who would have had reason to type that prescription label. Miss Kent typed labels for the medications she was substituting, but she claims the headache powder label was typed weeks ago and contained only harmless ingredients. Dr. Layton had no access to the pharmacy's typewriter, but you, Mr. Moss, use that typewriter regularly." "But why would I type a new label if I was going to poison Mr. Hartley?" Timothy protested. "That's exactly the question," Miss Marple said. "Why, indeed? Unless the label wasn't typed by the murderer at all, unless it was typed by someone else entirely for a completely different purpose." She set down her knitting and looked at Timothy with compassionate eyes. "You discovered what Mr. Hartley was doing, his illegal drug sales. You also discovered what Miss Kent was doing, and you decided to expose them both, didn't you?" Timothy's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes." "You were the one who sent the anonymous letter to Sarah Hartley. You wanted her here as a witness, someone else who had been harmed by Mr. Hartley's activities. You thought that with her testimony and your evidence you could finally bring him to justice." "He ruined her father," Timothy said, his voice growing stronger. "And he was ruining others. People trusted him with their health, their lives, and he betrayed that trust for profit. Someone had to stop him." "But you didn't kill him," Miss Marple said gently. "No, I swear I didn't. I went to the pharmacy that evening, after Mrs. Jeffries left. I wanted to confront him one final time, to tell him I knew everything and that I was going to the police. But when I got there, when I went upstairs, he was already dead, sitting in his chair with the powder beside him and the knitting needle in his neck." "And you panicked," Inspector Slack said. "Yes, I knew how it would look. I'd been arguing with him for weeks. I had motive, and I was there, alone with his body. So I ran. I left by the side door and went home. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I believe you, Mr. Moss. Which brings us to the real question. If neither Dr. Layton nor Mr. Moss killed Edmund Hartley, who did?" She turned to Mrs. Jeffries, who had been sitting quietly throughout all the revelations. "Mrs. Jeffries, you said you left the pharmacy at 8 o'clock. Is that correct?" "Yes, miss, as always." "And you saw no one else there when you left?" Mrs. Jeffries hesitated for just a moment, and in that hesitation, Miss Marple saw the truth. "You saw someone, didn't you, Mrs. Jeffries? Someone you didn't mention to the inspector." The older woman's composure finally crumbled. "I didn't think it mattered. They were just standing outside the shop, looking in the window." "Who was it?" Mrs. Jeffries looked at Sarah Hartley with an expression that was part apology, part pity. "It was her, Miss Hartley. She was standing outside the pharmacy, staring up at the window where the light was on." All eyes turned to Sarah, who had gone very still. "Miss Hartley," Miss Marple said softly, "I think you have something to tell us." Sarah's voice, when she finally spoke, was steady but filled with years of suppressed pain. "Yes, I was there. I couldn't stay away any longer. I'd come to St. Mary Mead because of that anonymous letter, but the more I thought about my father, about how my uncle had essentially killed him through greed and negligence, the angrier I became." So you went to confront him, Inspector Slack said. Yes. After Mrs. Jeffries left, I went to the side door. I'd watched the pharmacy for 2 days. I knew about that entrance. I thought I'd knock, demand to speak with him. But the door was unlocked. I went inside and upstairs. And what did you find? He was in his chair reading. He had a cup of cocoa beside him and that prescription bottle. When he saw me, he barely reacted. Just asked what I wanted, as if I was an inconvenient customer, rather than his brother's daughter. Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. I told him I knew everything, about the illegal drug sales, about how he'd supplied my father with more and more morphine until it killed him. I told him I was going to make sure he paid for what he'd done. And what did he say? He laughed, just like he'd done 10 years ago. He said I couldn't prove anything, that he'd covered his tracks too well. He said that even if I went to the police, he'd find a way to discredit me. Then he turned his back on me and took his headache powder. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. What happened then, Miss Hartley? He drank it down and went back to his reading, dismissing me. I was standing there, shaking with rage and grief when I saw it. On his desk, in plain view, was a syringe and a bottle of phenobarbital. I realized he was preparing to sell it, to send it to London like all the other drugs he'd stolen from people who needed them. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Something in me snapped. I picked up one of those silver knitting needles from his mother's old work basket by the chair. He didn't even notice. He was already getting drowsy from the powder. And I struck. The room was utterly silent except for the ticking of Miss Marple's clock. The powder he took, Inspector Slack said. Did you give it to him? No. It was already there, already prepared. I think he'd mixed it himself earlier. But I'd seen the phenobarbital on the desk, and I realized later that someone must have switched the contents of his headache powder. It wasn't me, but when I struck him with the knitting needle, he was already dying from the poison. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. So in the end, you didn't actually kill him. The poison did. But I intended to, Sarah said, tears finally streaming down her face. I struck him with that needle. I wanted him dead. For my father, for all the others he'd hurt. The fact that someone else had already poisoned him doesn't make me innocent. Inspector Slack moved toward her, but Miss Marple held up a hand. Inspector, I think we need to consider all the facts carefully. The medical examiner determined that Mr. Hartley died from phenobarbital poisoning, not from the wound in his neck, which means the actual cause of death was the substituted powder, not Miss Hartley's action. But who switched the powder? Timothy Moss asked. Miss Kent says she only put in harmless ingredients. Dr. Layton and I weren't there when he took it. That leaves... Miss Marple turned to Rosalind Kent. Miss Kent, you've admitted to substituting medications and creating false labels, but I don't think you've told us everything. You see, when Mr. Hartley confronted you about the thefts, he gave you until the end of the month. That was a death sentence of sorts, wasn't it? The end of your life as you knew it. Rosalind Kent's facade finally shattered completely. He was going to destroy me. My reputation, my livelihood, everything. And for what? For doing exactly what he'd been doing for years. The hypocrisy was unbearable. So you decided to kill him first, Inspector Slack said. I decided to give him a taste of his own medicine, Rosalind said bitterly. Literally. I went to the pharmacy the evening before he died. I knew his routine, knew he'd mixed himself a batch of headache powder that would last him several days. While he was upstairs, I used my key to enter the shop. I went to his personal cabinet and switched the contents of his powder with pure phenobarbital from his backup stock. I knew he'd take it eventually, and when he did, it would look like an accidental overdose. A tragic mistake by a man who'd grown careless with his own medications. But why type a new label? Inspector Slack asked. I didn't. The label was one I'd typed weeks earlier when I was still substituting medications. I reused it because it had the correct date and looked official. I didn't know the typewriter was distinctive. I thought I was being clever. Miss Marple nodded sadly. And so, We have a death caused by multiple hands. Miss Kent poisoned the powder intending murder. Miss Hartley struck with the knitting needle intending murder. But the medical evidence shows Mr. Hartley died from the poison, not the wound. What does that mean legally? Timothy asked. Inspector Slack looked grim. It means Miss Kent is guilty of murder, and Miss Hartley is guilty of attempted murder. The law doesn't care that Mr. Hartley was already dying when she struck him. As Inspector Slack prepared to take both women into custody, Miss Marple spoke once more. There's a lesson in all of this, I think. Edmund Hartley sowed seeds of greed and betrayal, and they grew into a poisonous harvest that ultimately consumed him. He created an environment where those around him felt justified in taking the law into their own hands. In trying to protect his illegal activities, he made enemies of everyone who discovered the truth. She looked at Dr. Layton, at Timothy Moss, at Mrs. Jeffreys. All of you knew parts of the truth. All of you wanted justice but felt powerless to obtain it through proper channels. That's the real tragedy here. Not just one man's death, but the erosion of trust and moral authority that allowed his crimes to flourish for so long. As the group dispersed and Inspector Slack led Rosalind Kent and Sarah Hartley away, Miss Marple sat alone in her sitting room, her knitting in her lap. The case was solved, the pattern complete. But unlike her knitting, there was no satisfaction in this finished work, only sadness for the tangled threads of human weakness and the destructive power of unchecked greed. Florence brought in fresh tea, and Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicking softly in the quiet room. Outside, St. Mary Mead went about its business, the village settling back into its normal rhythms. But for those who had been touched by this case, nothing would ever be quite the same again. The deadly prescription had claimed multiple victims in the end, not just Edmund Hartley, but all those whose lives had been twisted and darkened by his crimes and their own desperate responses to them. Justice had been served, but at a cost that weighed heavily on everyone involved. And so, dear listeners, we reach the end of our journey through this tangled mystery. As Miss Marple knew well, the human heart is capable of both great good and terrible evil, often driven by circumstances that push ordinary people to extraordinary actions. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, justice was ultimately served, but the scars of greed, betrayal, and vengeance would linger long after the case was closed. Thank you for joining me, William, on this episode of Mindful Musings. Until we meet again, may your days be peaceful and your mysteries confined to the pages of books. The end.